Hello everyone. Today we are going to present you about overview of the region development in Latin America with two countries, Brazil and Venezuela. Here are the table of contents. Our presentation will consist of introduction, overview of Brazil and Venezuela, comparing Brazil and Venezuela politics and obstacle. The first part is introduction. According to South America region, though it has been out of interest of many to study, it is indeed a continent of social, cultural, and environmental differences. South African country also possess a wide range of sovereignty from the full sovereign state to the dependency of such state. This region also experienced many kinds of events, whether they are the colonization, being the US backyard and facing the last decade. Therefore, this presentation attempts to compare the similarity and differences between two countries, Brazil and Venezuela, in the aspect of economic development. While half of South America GDP come from Brazil, conversely, Venezuela has been facing the economic crisis, political issue, and other domestic problems which drag the whole country down the hill. Additionally, Brazil also is one of the wealthiest country in the world, but it has been ranked in one of the most unequal nations. And Venezuela has been able to manage itself into a state of chaos with hyperinflation, whereas the country holds the world's largest oil reserves.
For the next section, we will talk about the overview of two countries. For the overview of Brazil, Brazil is one of the most unequal nations in the world, although it is one of the wealthiest nations in the world as well. Historically, it is a fact that natural resources were the abundant productive factor in Latin America. They were more intensively used in the production of exportable commodity. As a result, since the ownership of the natural resource is more concentrated than of labor, income distribution tend to be more skewed toward landowner, and inequality rose over the decade prior to the First World War. According to the United Nations Development Programme or UNDP, income inequality as measured by the Gini index are higher only than those of some very poor African countries such as Namibia. However, the World Bank ranks the Brazilian economy among the 10 richest in the world with a gross domestic product or GDP of 1.7 trillion per capita, similar to the Italian GDP. The country's high income concentration is prevail in Africa, the richest 1% of the population. Less than 2 million people have 13% of all household income. This percentage is similar to that of the poorest 50%, approximately 80 million Brazilians. This inequality results in poverty levels that are inconsistent with with an economic design of that of Brazil. Besides income inequality, in Brazil, there is also gender and race-based discrimination. The exclusion experienced by women and black people is directly related to sexist and racist phenomena. In fact, the persistence of gender and race inequality for decades indicate that individuals continue to be actively discriminated against as a result of their sex or color in different spheres of society, such as school, the labor market, political circle, and in the family. It makes the differentiate participation of women and black people in different social spheres appear to be more normal, thus reinforcing the stigmatization of these different groups. It hinders them from achieving their individual potential and prevents the exercise of their rights as Brazilian citizens. In addition, the exclusion process experienced by women and black people strained the hierarchical and authoritarian feature of society, as well as it widened the social gap that characterized contemporary Brazil. Therefore, racial and gender inequality are not restricted to issues that affect only part of the nation population, black people or women. They represent a problem that affects Brazilian society as a whole. Next is the overview of Venezuela. Venezuela is the world's largest oil reserve. Oil sales account for 98% of exporting earnings and as much as 50% of GDP. In 2014, the oil price plummeted. The government of Nicolas Maduro proposed the fiscal policy as printing more cash in order to boost the economic system instead of imposing tax and changing its dangerous price or wage control. As Venezuela is the petrol state, which is government income mostly depend on the export of oil. Political power is highly concentrated in an elite minority, and political institutions are weak and unaccountable. Therefore, corruption is widespread. Under this condition, printing more money simply made the problem worse. It added to the supply of currency, pushing the value down even further. This cycle eventually caused hyperinflation in Venezuela. Moreover, not only the economic issue that Venezuela has been experiencing for years since 2014, the political issue also has been embedded, and it is too difficult to solve at this point. Unsurprisingly, in spite of sitting in the world's largest oil reserve, Venezuela now is miserable. Therefore, because of economic and political issues in Venezuela, inequality and poverty problems were overlooked. Another important issue is gender inequality in Venezuela. Despite Venezuela claiming of being a top activist of women's rights in Latin America, gender equality is still very much a work in progress. It is clear that women are still treated unfairly by looking at typical gender roles. Men overwhelmingly occupy the most important political, economic, social, and religious position in Venezuela, as its long-standing culture that women were dominated by men. However, there is progress toward gender inequality in Venezuela as well. In the labor participation, the involvement of women raised from 17.5% in 1950 to 43.5% in 1998. And next slide is in this paper, we will examine the development of both countries by using the Human Development Index or HDI proposed by the United Nations Development Programme or UNDP. The HDI aims to emphasize that people and their capability should be the ultimate criteria for accessing the development of a country in three basic dimensions of human development. The first one is a long and healthy life. The second is access to knowledge and education. And the third one is a decent standard of living, not economic growth alone. Therefore, the high level of HDI value mean that such a country has a higher long and healthy life, education, and standard of living. However, the HDI value only did not reflect the inequality, poverty, and human security. So in this paper, along with HDI value, we will use another measure to analyze both countries, which is the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, or IHDI. By 2010, the United Nations Development Programme proposed IHDI in order to specifically account for inequality by discounting each dimension average value according to its level of inequality. while the HDI can be viewed as an index of average achievement in human development dimension. The IHDI is the level of human development when the distribution of achievement across people in the society is accounted for. For the HDI value of Brazil in 2019 is accounted as 0.765, positioning it at 84 out of 198 countries and territories. Brazil's 2019 HDI is below the average for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. As you can see, the HDI value of Brazil between 1990 to 2019 from the graph at the right side. The HDI value of Brazil is the red line. The HDI value of Brazil since 2015 seem to be almost identical. The HDI value for each year are slightly different, and we will discuss it later. And for the HDI value of Venezuela, which is the blue line, Venezuela HDI value for 2019 is 0.71, positioning it at 113 out of 189 countries and territories. The 2019 HDI value of Venezuela is considered as below the average for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean as well, since the Venezuelan inflation rate is on rise, particularly since 2014 when the oil price plummeted. And if we look at the blue line, which is the HDI value of Venezuela during 2014 onward, the HDI value of Venezuela gradually declined.
Okay, please move to the Gini index. Besides, in order to measure the poverty or inequality in such country, there is another international measure encouraged by the World Bank, which is Gini coefficient or Gini index. Gini index aims to measure the extent to which the distribution of income, or in some cases, which is the consumption expenditure among individual or household, which in an economy deviate from a perfectly equal distribution. A Gini index of 0 represents as a perfect equality, while an index of 100 represents as a perfect inequality. So Brazil Gini index, which was 53.4%, which is slightly different from the previous year. In 2018 is 53.9 and 2017 is 53.3. So move to the Venezuela Gini index. In the case of Venezuela, the Gini index was last updated by World Bank in 2006, which is 46.9%. Next slide, please. Here is a graph demonstrating the Gini index of Brazil until the 2019. So at the end, we gather the data and put it on the table in order to compare HDI, IHDI, and Gini index between Brazil and Venezuela. In some, HDI value of Venezuela seem to be gradually decreasing because of hyperinflation, along with the poor government and inefficient monetary policy to tackle the issue, as you can see from the table 1. On the other hand, Brazil HDI value seem to be moderate, as Brazil has been ranked in the 84th place for 3 consecutive years. Apart from that, we found that the IHDI value of both countries seem to be in a negative relation as a HDI value witness. Yet, surprisingly, the IHDI value of Venezuela is higher than Brazil, though the HDI value of Brazil is higher than Venezuela. Moreover, we also estimate the Gini index of both countries to specifically estimate the degree of inequality. Venezuela Gini Index account for 44.8, ranking at the 24th place out of the world. Meanwhile, Brazil Gini Index account for 53.4, ranking at the 8th place. In this sense, from analyzing by true methodology, the inequality issue in Brazil tend to be more intense than Venezuela. From the table 1, Brazil HDI is moderately on the average of Latin America due to the various factors such as rapidly economic growth, rising in education and technology in the mid of 1990s. However, it is crucially to be noted that the IHDI value of Brazil is not correspondingly on average at HDI. As from the table 1, IHDI Brazil is 0.57 in 2019, which is lower from the previous year, which is 0.574 in 2018 and 0.578 in 2017. This lower IHDI of Brazil can be explained as the income inequality remains as a crucial obstacle in Brazil. According to Marcio Postman, to observe the actual income gap between rich and poor, it should be observed income distribution in only income from labor, and do not take into account profit, dividend, rent, and interest rate, because all of these are the source of wealth for the country's most affluent family. He also explained that 5,000 very rich families, which account for 0.001% of all Brazilian families, keep 3% of total national income, and their assets amount to approximately 40% of Brazilian GDP. Moreover, according to the official data for national account, the share of wealth in total income has been dropping steadily during the past 10 years, from 45% of GDP in 1994 to a little over 30% in 2008. Thus, it can be said that social inequality are more complex in Brazil. At the same time, there is no implementation of an effective land development policy to ensure democratic access to the land and strengthen family agriculture, and also mitigate the urban-rural gap as well. Moreover, tax reform remain not to be promoted in order to enhance fiscal justice and make sure that the rich pay proportionally more tax. Next slide, please.
Moving on to the comparison between Brazil and Venezuela politics. Today, although Brazil and Venezuela are located not far from each other, their political and economic developments are similar in some perspectives. When looking through the Brazil's political system, it can be seen that it is governed by the federal presidential system, which is similar to the system of Venezuela. Moreover, they share the similarity in their legal system, which is a civil law. However, there are some differences in their political structure. For Brazil, it is different from Venezuela in terms of political party system, which is a multi-party system, while Venezuela has dominant party system. Here's some overview of Venezuela's political economy. By the time of Venezuela under the administration of Carlos Andrés Pérez, there was a nationalization of oil industry in 1976. It is a time of booming crude oil prices and rising resource of nationalism. He visioned that the opportunity for the state over the economy, and especially wanted to use the country's rapidly growing oil wealth to boost the development of the nation. That year, to gain full national control of the oil fields, the government banished foreign oil firms and created a new state-run oil monopoly called Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA. But however, in 1993, Perez was impeached due to his corruption. Later in 1998, Chavez launched the Bolivarian Revolution and fulfilled an election promise by calling a constituent assembly in 1999, which drafted a new constitution of Venezuela. However, Chavez was granted executive power by the National Assembly to rule by decree multiple times throughout his tenure. After the inauguration of Hugo Chavez in 1999, he continued the nationalizing the oil industry and used the profit to fund food subsidies, education, and healthcare programs. Under his administration, unemployment and poverty are cut by half, and income per capita improved more than double. Moreover, he implemented energy price subsidies and encouraged Venezuelan people to stop agriculture. These actions can be perceived as a populist policy. This particular form of policy is most of the time utilized by the government in order to gain the base popular support. When it comes to the background of the context of Venezuela, the majority of the population of Venezuela is the grassroots class, in which Chavez populist policy harvested the vote from this particular group of people, as well as to extend his presidency. Apart from the government oil industry, other industries such as agricultural, commerce, and manufacturing industries remain stagnated in terms of development. Since 2013, Nicolas Maduro has been the president until the present. This inauguration is the continuation of Chavez's revolution. In 2015, there was an oil crisis. The oil price plummeted from prior year at $100 per barrel to $40 per barrel. The reason being that the United States, which is one of the largest importers of petroleum from OPEC, discovered a technology to extract the oil from the shale energy. Venezuela as a country that solely depends on the oil exports started to be affected by the massive reduction in oil price. These detrimental effects on national oil price also contributed to a severe economic crisis. For instance, hyperinflation of over 53,798 and 5,500% between 2006 and April 2019. As a consequence, the Maduro government decided to cut public spending and extend price control on more basic goods in order to combat the hyperinflation level.
Okay, moving on to the overall Brazil economy. It was ruled by the military regime between 1979 and 1985 under the administration of General Gisels and continued under the General Figueiredo. The economy in that period was in the crisis due to the oil shock in 1973. However, there was a redemocratization from 1985 to 1989. By that time, President Sani declared a unilateral postpone on the foreign debt as Brazil was facing a crucial financial crisis in which the capital growth rate fell between 1981 and 1992, labeled as the lost decades. Crucially, the major political development for Brazil could not be indicated at the start of the financial crisis that took place in the early 1980s, which put an end to the military regimes of the Brazil. The factors that have highly contributed to the Brazil democratization are the accelerating inflation and the short-term success of the price and wage freeze in 1986. Nevertheless, Brazil's political euphoria has come to an end due to the series of failed unconventional stabilization attempts and debt moratorium, as well as a new populist constitution that had become ratified in 1988. Therefore, with all mentioned reasons, Brazil had become a virtually ungovernable country for a period of time. On the economic development concerns of Brazil, one of the critical determinants of Brazil's economic futures was the decision to deal with the 1973 oil shock by promoting a capital-intensive import substitution strategy by the General Giselle, whereby Brazil had relied on a deep dependence on the international recycling of the petrodollars, which have unfortunately, regarding the deteriorate international scenario at that time, Brazil's action have caused the excessive domestic demand and wage indexation, which tremendously increased domestic inflation and the trade deficit. Moreover, the relative value of investment continued to increase and capital productivity also fell drastically during 1974 and 1984. Thus, this period of time had characterized Brazil as a technical regression rather than a technical progress, as well as the international environment that played a huge role in forcing the country to suspend its external debt payment during the 1982. As the inflation rate continued to rise during the 1980s to the early 1990s, Brazil's economy encountered a massive downfall where citizens highly suffered to make their ends meet. However, in 1994, Brazil implemented one of the most effective policies to counter the inflation called the Real Plan. The government establishes a new currency for the country named Real, which is constantly appreciated toward the US dollar. By the late 1996, the inflation by some measures approaches an annual rate of less than 20%, a remarkable achievement in the economy. When it comes to poverty, Brazil has put a tremendous effort to alleviate the nation poverty from 1980s to 2000s. The extreme poverty rate plummeted from 23% to 8.3% in 2009. Therefore, in the next slide, both Brazil and Venezuela have faced the inflation crisis in 1980s. While Brazil economic inflation was mitigated by the Real Plan in 1994, Venezuela economy was wrecked. In addition, both of them had an overlapping interest in anti-poverty policy. There was an anti-poverty program in Brazil in 1993 and in 1999 under the administration of Hugo Chavez, the Venezuela president in that era. The poverty and unemployment rate in the state was diminished. However, in the 1970s, Brazil was confronted with the oil shock, whereas it was a booming crude oil export for Venezuela, today the largest oil exporting country. Lastly, one important difference between Brazil and Venezuela is that Brazil was successfully dealt with the inflation, even though it is a short term as well. With the utilization of the real plan, unfortunately, the attempt to solve the inflation of Venezuela became impossible due to the lukewarm perception of the economic issues.
So, moving on to the obstacles, according to the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, also known as the Global Goals, were adopted by all the United Nations member states in 2015 as a universal call to action to end the poverty, protect the planet, and to ensure all the people enjoy peace and the prosperity by 2030. However, for Brazil and Venezuela to pursue the sustainable development, they face many obstacles to pursue the sustainable political and the economic development. Politically, the crucial obstacle is the prolonged corruption issue. In Brazil, there is a popular case called the Operation Car Wash. This case started in 2014, focusing on the small businesses such as the car wash and gas stations for laundering the money. This relates to the politicians saying that the money from these businesses were distributed to the politicians to continue to support the election for the long-lasting government. For Venezuela, at the time of the inauguration of Hugo Chavez in 1998, he drafted a new constitution in favor of his prolonged
power in Venezuela, and later resulted in destroying the existing political institutions and replacing it with a flawed bureaucracy. Therefore, according to the Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index has ranked Venezuela as the 176 out of 180 countries in the survey, with a score of 15 out of 100. And economically, due to the international debt crisis in 1982, the effects have caused the economy to become stagnated in various Latin American countries, including Brazil and Venezuela. Moreover, it's also caused the government incomes and imports to drop dramatically. Crucially, the debt crisis might as well decrease the investment rate that is used to address the important social issues and the poverty problems in both Brazil and Venezuela. In 2015, Latin American countries still have a huge amount of the external debt since the debt crisis. While Brazil has the highest amount of debt, which is the 535,400 million US dollar, in which it is the first rank among the Latin American states. Venezuela has 89,660 million US dollars in the external debt, which is in the sixth rank among the others. As a result, these issues delayed both political and economic development. The concern in corruption in both Brazil and Venezuela government have disrupted the development in the nation regarding the misuse of their national profits and incomes. Additionally, the debt crisis shifts the focus of the governments from developing the nations to repaying the international debts. The government income should be effectively spent on the state development for the better future. And that's it for our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.